It was 1945. The Second World War was nearing its violent end. Across Europe, the Reich was collapsing under the combined weight of the Allies and the Soviet advance. Cities lay in ruins, fuel and ammunition were running out, and yet inside secret German laboratories, scientists were still sketching blueprints for weapons that sounded more like science fiction than war. One of those ideas was something extraordinary, something they called the Sun Gun. The concept wasn't entirely born from Nazi imagination. It traced back to 1929, when the German rocket pioneer Hermann Oberth published a book titled Wege zur Raumschifffahrt, Ways to Spaceflight. In it, Oberth envisioned a giant mirror floating in space, designed to reflect sunlight toward Earth. His purpose wasn't destruction, it was energy. He imagined a peaceful orbital station collecting solar power, focusing it to generate electricity or control the weather. But as with many scientific dreams of that era, it didn't take long for the military mind to see a darker potential. By the early 1940s, Nazi Germany had built an entire culture around so-called wonder weapons. The V-2 rocket, the jet-powered Me-262, and remote-controlled flying bombs were only a few of the technologies born from desperation. Hitler AS scientists were encouraged to think big, to find a miracle that could turn the tide of war. It was during this feverish period, sometime around 1944, that Oberth's theoretical mirror was reborn as a weapon. The Sun Gun, or Sonnengewehr, was envisioned as a gigantic orbital reflector, a mirror the size of a city, capable of focusing the sun's energy on enemy targets. The concept was outrageous, but in the final years of the war, Nazi scientists had nothing left to lose. They imagined building the structure piece by piece, launching the segments into orbit once they mastered rocket technology, then assembling the mirror at a height of about 8,000 kilometers above Earth. From that altitude, it could, at least in theory, concentrate sunlight into a beam of unbearable heat. According to post-war interviews with German scientists, the mirror's surface would have been made of metallic sodium, chosen for its reflectivity. Once aligned properly, the device could, in theory, focus a deadly ray upon any city below, boiling oceans or incinerating armies with solar fire. One German engineer claimed that the project might be completed within 50 to 100 years, given enough resources. It was a breathtaking prediction, both visionary and delusional. The Americans first learned about the idea in 1945, when they interrogated captured scientists from the Hillersleben Research Center in central Germany. Reports described an orbital mirror weapon proposed during the last phase of the war. One U.S. officer referred to it as a space station death ray. Newspapers and magazines picked up the story almost immediately. In July 1945, Time magazine published an article titled The Sun Gun, describing how Nazi physicists had dreamed of launching a concave mirror a mile across that could focus sunlight into a single point on Earth. The public read it as both terrifying and absurd, a glimpse into the kind of madness that had consumed Hitler's Reich. Yet even at the height of Nazi ambition, the project remained fantasy. Germany didn't possess the rocket power, the materials, or the understanding of orbital mechanics to make it remotely feasible. Building a structure a mile wide in space would have required millions of tons of sodium metal, a launch capacity that wouldn't exist for decades, and precise control systems far beyond 1940s technology. The V-2, their most advanced rocket, could barely reach 200 kilometers before falling back to Earth. The Sun Gun would have needed to orbit 40 times higher. Still, the idea fascinated both sides of the war. For the Allies, it was proof of just how far the Nazis were willing to go in their search for a miracle weapon. For scientists, it was a strange preview of what might one day be possible. In fact, within a few years, many of the same German engineers who had once worked on Hitler's rocket program were recruited into the American space effort under Operation Paperclip. The seeds of the Nazi Sun Gun would reappear, not as weapons, but as theoretical discussions about orbital solar power, laser satellites, and the future of warfare in space. In 1947, U.S. intelligence files still mentioned the Sun Gun in debriefings of German scientists. They described it as a project that never went beyond design studies, but one that showed how desperate the Nazis had become by 1944. Facing defeat on all fronts, the Reich's leadership had encouraged every possible form of innovation, no matter how outlandish. Some proposals were grounded in real physics, others, like the sun gun, bordered on the mythological. It is easy to laugh at the concept today, a space mirror weapon built during a time when most rockets still exploded on the launch pad. But behind the fantasy was a real reflection of the era S mindset, an unshakable belief that technology alone could conquer fate. In that belief, the Nazis weren't alone. During the Cold War that followed, both the United States and the Soviet Union would explore their own space-based weapons, from orbital mirrors to directed energy beams. The sun gun, as impossible as it seemed, had predicted a future where the skies themselves might become a battlefield. Looking back, what makes the sun gun story remarkable isn't its feasibility, it's what it reveals about the mentality of a collapsing regime. In the ruins of 1945 Germany, engineers were sketching weapons that could reach the heavens, while their factories burned and their cities starved. It was science unmoored from reality, but deeply symbolic of a regime that believed domination could come from sheer imagination. The war would end before any real construction began. Allied troops captured what few notes and sketches existed. Some historians believe that only a handful of scientists ever seriously discussed it, and that most of the story was inflated by post-war myth-making. But myth or not, the idea remains one of the most haunting examples of technological delusion in human history. Proof that even in their final days, the Nazis dreamed not of surrender, but of controlling the very power of the sun itself. When the war ended in 1945, Allied forces rushed to capture every scrap of German science they could find. Jet engines, rockets, radar systems, and buried among them, a handful of strange files referencing something that sounded like fantasy. It was listed under various names: Sonnengewehr, Sun Mirror Project, sometimes simply Orbital Reflector. American interrogators didn't know what to make of it, but as they began questioning the scientists who had worked on advanced weapons, a few mentioned an idea so extraordinary that it made the atom bomb seem almost ordinary. One of those scientists was Dr. Hermann Oberth, a name already known to Allied intelligence. Oberth had been one of the founding fathers of modern rocketry, a man who inspired both Werner von Braun and the entire German V2 program. His 1929 book had proposed using a space station equipped with a concave mirror to focus sunlight onto Earth. It wasn't meant as a weapon. In his mind, such a station could illuminate cities, melt ice for agriculture, or serve as a beacon for space exploration. But in wartime Germany, even peaceful ideas had a way of turning dark. Oberth was never directly part of the Nazi weapons program, but his theories circulated through Germany's scientific community in the 1930s. His students and colleagues, men like von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and others connected to the Peenemünde Army Research Center, became the core of the Third Reich's rocket initiative. Somewhere within that circle, perhaps in the final 2 years of the war, someone began wondering whether Oberth's solar mirror could be weaponized. Accounts differ on who revived the idea, but several interrogations after the war pointed to the Hillersleben proving grounds, about 130 kilometers west of Berlin. It was a secret testing site where artillery and experimental weapons were studied under the Army Ordnance Office. American troops reached it in April 1945. Inside, they found engineers still working on projects that seemed detached from reality, including blueprints for enormous orbital constructions. When questioned, some of the researchers mentioned a giant mirror in space that could burn cities. To the soldiers hearing this, it sounded like lunacy. According to surviving reports, the proposal had been discussed by a small group of scientists, possibly under a theoretical study branch within the German Army Weapons Agency. They had done rough calculations to produce a beam of heat powerful enough to ignite a city. A mirror several kilometers wide would have to orbit above the atmosphere. The material suggested was metallic sodium, a lightweight and reflective metal that could, in theory, be melted, molded, and cooled into thin sheets. The sun gun's orbital altitude was estimated at around 8,200 kilometers, about 1/5 the distance to the moon. When these details surfaced in 1945, American intelligence officers compiled them into technical briefings. One of those summaries, later publicized in Time magazine, claimed that the Nazis had envisioned the project taking 50 to 100 years to complete, assuming humanity ever built rockets powerful enough to reach orbit. To the public, it read like pulp science fiction. But to the engineers analyzing it, the idea wasn't entirely nonsense. The physics were correct. The technology simply didn't exist. Wernher von Braun, who had led the V-2 rocket program, was asked about the Sun Gun during his early interviews with U.S. Army intelligence. He reportedly laughed at the idea, calling it theoretical and centuries away. But the mere fact that the discussion took place reveals how far German scientists were willing to think beyond the limits of their time. For a nation that had just built the world's first ballistic missile, dreaming of space-based mirrors wasn't as far-fetched as it seemed. In the chaos of 1945, no physical models of the Sun Gun were ever found. What the Allies recovered were sketches, partial notes, and verbal recollections. Historians later concluded that it was never an active project, more of a brainstorming concept tossed around by physicists intrigued by orbital mechanics. Still, it symbolized something crucial: the growing intersection between warfare and outer space. It's important to remember that by the 1940s, humanity had never left Earth's atmosphere. Even the concept of satellites was speculative. Yet within Nazi Germany, scientists were already imagining not only reaching orbit, but using it as a platform for global domination. The Sun Gun was part of a broader vision, a future in which space stations, long-range missiles, and orbital platforms could project power across the planet. After the war, as Allied scientists pored over captured documents, they noticed patterns. Many Nazi engineers viewed technology almost mystically as a path to salvation. The Sun Gun fit that pattern perfectly. It represented the ultimate illusion of control, to command the sun itself. By 1946, as the United States and the Soviet Union began their silent competition for German scientific talent, the Sun Gun briefly resurfaced in classified discussions. American military researchers at Fort Bliss and White Sands reviewed fragments of the concept, wondering if solar reflectors could have any peaceful use. They concluded it was impractical. The energy losses through atmospheric scattering alone would make the beam weak by the time it reached Earth. But the underlying notion, harnessing solar energy from orbit, quietly seeded future studies decades later in NASA and Soviet space programs. For the German scientists, though, it was the end of the dream. Oberth was brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip, where he continued to advocate for peaceful space exploration. Von Braun became the architect of the Saturn V rocket that would take humanity to the moon. And somewhere between those real achievements and the myths of wartime science, the Sun Gun faded into legend. The surviving documents from Hillersleben paint an eerie picture. Amidst drawings of artillery and rockets, there are rough circles labeled solar mirror, equations calculating reflection angles, and notes about orbital stabilization. No blueprints for weapons, no funding records, just the fingerprints of imagination at work during an age of destruction. Historians today debate whether the Sun Gun story was exaggerated by the Allies for propaganda, or misunderstood by interrogators who misinterpreted theoretical physics notes as weapon designs. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. There were scientists who discussed it, but they never had the means or time to build it. Still, its existence as an idea captures a revealing truth about Nazi science in the war's final days. Even as the Reich was collapsing, its thinkers were gazing upward, dreaming of miracles in the stars while the world around them burned. That combination of genius and delusion would echo long after the war. The United States would soon launch its first satellites, then its first astronauts. The Soviets would do the same. Within 2 decades, humanity would achieve what Nazi scientists had only imagined, reaching space. And with it came a haunting echo of the Sun Gun, the realization that the heavens could one day become a new arena for conflict. In the years that followed World War II, the story of the Nazi Sun Gun refused to disappear. It was one of those ideas that lived on in rumor, in newspaper clippings, and in the whispers of intelligence officers who wondered just how close the Germans had been to controlling something as vast as sunlight itself. By the late 1940s, the world had entered a new kind of tension, a Cold War built not only on ideology, but on imagination. And that imagination, it turned out, was fertile ground for legends like the sun gun. In 1946, reports about the mysterious Nazi weapon reached American newspapers once again. This time, they were mixed with speculation about whether the United States could take over where the Germans had left off. If Nazi scientists had dreamed of orbiting mirrors, what might the new superpowers build once they reached space? At the time, the U.S. Army had only just begun testing captured V-2 rockets at White Sands, New Mexico. Each launch carried fragments of German engineering, sometimes even German scientists themselves, standing alongside American officers. The line between fiction and classified research was starting to blur. By the early 1950s, both the US and the Soviet Union were studying the military potential of space. Satellites were still years away, but military planners were already considering what orbit could mean for warfare. If a mirror could focus sunlight, could it also reflect radio signals or direct radar beams across continents? The same basic principles were being tested, only this time they were grounded in practical technology rather than myth. Still, somewhere in those early meetings, the sun gun was sometimes mentioned, a ghost of German ambition haunting the birth of the space age. For the Soviets, the idea had its own resonance. After the war, they too had captured German scientists and documents, some from the same Hillersleben facilities that the Americans had raided. Soviet engineers pored over those records, many of which mentioned the theoretical solar mirror. In the Soviet Union's early rocket program led by Sergei Korolev, there were even classified discussions about using space-based reflectors to light northern cities during the long Arctic winter. The idea of using sunlight as a tool or a weapon was spreading quietly across both sides of the Iron Curtain. As the 1950s turned to the 1960s, humanity finally began to reach orbit. The launch of Sputnik in 1957 marked the start of a new race, not just to explore space but to control it. Satellites became the eyes and ears of nations. Communication, reconnaissance, and surveillance all moved into the heavens. The sun gun suddenly seemed less like fantasy and more like a distant cousin of what was now unfolding above Earth. Every rocket that roared into the sky brought humanity closer to the kind of technological power that Nazi scientists could only sketch on paper. In 1961, as Cold War paranoia deepened, the newly formed NASA and the Pentagon began to study concepts that sounded eerily similar to those wartime fantasies. Some engineers proposed enormous orbital mirrors to reflect sunlight onto dark regions of the Earth, providing light for agriculture or disaster relief. Others, less publicly, considered whether those same mirrors could be used to dazzle enemy satellites or blind sensors on the ground. The military fascination with solar energy was back, and though it was cloaked in the language of research, its inspiration traced straight back to the sun gun's shadow. But the physics hadn't changed. Any mirror large enough to focus sunlight with destructive intensity would need to be kilometers wide, with perfect alignment and stability. Even small deviations would scatter the light harmlessly across the atmosphere. Scientists who revisited the sun gun concept during the early space race quickly realized that the numbers didn't work. The amount of sunlight hitting Earth was simply too diffuse. To burn a city, you'd need a mirror that could collect hundreds of gigawatts of energy, something far beyond what any material could withstand. Still, the dream persisted. In 1962, a declassified RAND Corporation report discussed solar reflectors in orbit as part of long-term speculative military research. It concluded that while the destructive potential was negligible, the psychological effect of such a device could be enormous. A visible orbiting light beam or moving reflection across the sky could serve as a show of power, a symbol of technological dominance. The sun gun, even if impossible, had become a metaphor for control, a reminder that whoever mastered space would hold the ultimate vantage point. Meanwhile, the public imagination ran wild. Science fiction magazines in the 1950s and 60s began reimagining the Nazi sun gun as a cautionary tale. Movies and pulp novels showed fascist regimes or rogue scientists constructing orbital mirrors to destroy cities or melt the poles. It was propaganda, but it fed into real fears. The idea that the same sky humanity looked up at in wonder could one day hold weapons of mass destruction became part of the collective psyche. When the United States launched its first spy satellites under the Corona program in the early 1960s, journalists speculated that they might be capable of more than taking photographs. Some even hinted, incorrectly, that these orbiters could redirect sunlight or energy beams. Those rumors weren't true, but they show how deeply the sun gun myth had embedded itself in Cold War culture. Every mysterious light in the sky, every new classified project, seemed to echo the Nazi dream of turning the heavens into a weapon. By the 1970s, real research into orbital mirrors began again, this time for peaceful purposes. The Soviet Union proposed Znamya, a space experiment to deploy a giant reflective disk that could redirect sunlight onto Earth to extend daylight hours. When it was tested decades later in the 1990s, the reflection was visible from the ground as a slow-moving spot of light across the night sky. Ironically, the experiment used technology the Nazis could never have imagined, yet it still resembled their original concept. The difference was intention. The sun gun was born from desperation and the lust for domination. Znamya and later NASA's solar power satellites were born from curiosity and the need for energy. Still, the parallels were hard to ignore. The same basic ambition to capture and control sunlight connected them across time. In a way, the Nazi sun gun had predicted not a weapon, but a future in which humanity's reach extended beyond Earth. But inside government archives, the sun gun story remained useful. Throughout the Cold War, intelligence agencies occasionally cited it in declassified documents as an example of how enemy states might think beyond conventional warfare. It was used as a cautionary tale, proof that imagination could sometimes outpace sanity, and that no idea, no matter how absurd, should be dismissed outright in an age of technological escalation. By the time the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, the sun gun had become something of a historical footnote, a symbol of Nazi hubris and scientific fantasy, yet its ghost lingered. Every new announcement of space-based defense systems, from anti-satellite lasers to orbital energy projects, seemed to carry a faint echo of that wartime dream. The idea that power, ultimate power, could be drawn from the very light of the sun. Even decades after the Third Reich collapsed, the Nazi sun gun refused to fade from public consciousness. It survived in a new form, shifting from a secret wartime project into a symbol of forbidden science, a touchstone for conspiracies and speculative histories. As Cold War tensions deepened, the story resurfaced again and again, no longer as an imminent threat, but as a haunting what-if from the past. Newspapers, television specials, and eventually the internet turned the sun gun into one of the most famous examples of Nazi technological mythology. By the late 1960s and early 70s, a wave of books began appearing in Europe and North America, cataloguing Hitler's secret weapons. These volumes, often written with little access to original archives, mixed genuine research with sensationalist claims. The sun gun was always near the top of the list, presented alongside rumored anti-gravity devices, secret Antarctic bases, and plans for moon colonies. It made for gripping reading. Here was a defeated regime that, in its dying days, supposedly sketched weapons so advanced they belonged to another century. In reality, almost none of these claims were supported by hard evidence, but the mere possibility was enough to keep readers turning pages. Television soon followed. In the 1970s and 80s, as documentaries about World War II proliferated, producers discovered the sun gun story. Grainy footage of V-2 launches and Peenemünde engineers was intercut with artists' renderings of giant orbital mirrors glinting above Earth, casting blazing beams of light onto cities below. These programs blurred the line between speculation and fact. Viewers were left to wonder, could the Nazis really have done it? Was some of their technology decades ahead of its time? This uncertainty was amplified by the secrecy surrounding space programs in the same era. Both the US and the Soviet Union were conducting classified satellite projects, many of which the public could only guess at. In that climate, the sun gun seemed plausible, a warning from history that nothing was too outlandish to be attempted. Conspiracy theorists seized on it, They claimed the Allies had secretly completed the weapon after the war, or that it had been hidden in underground bases. None of these allegations held up under scrutiny, but they fueled an entire genre of alternative history. The rise of the Internet in the 1990s gave the Sun Gun new life. Web forums, early blogs, and online encyclopedias recycled the same wartime drawings and Time magazine articles. Some added fabricated blueprints, others linked it to unrelated NASA projects, claiming the American government was about to unveil a modern version of the Nazi weapon. The idea meshed perfectly with the growing fascination around black projects and secret space programs. It became part of a larger mythos, the notion that governments were hiding unimaginable technologies while feeding the public only a sanitized version of reality. Part of what makes the Sun Gun so persistent is that it touches on two powerful human themes: the fear of overwhelming power and the fascination with forbidden knowledge. The Nazis, already synonymous with evil in the public imagination, become the perfect villains for such a story. If anyone would attempt to weaponize the sun, it would be them. This narrative also resonates because the Sun Gun is just plausible enough to stir unease. Unlike flying saucers or time machines, the physics behind orbital mirrors is real. That tension between possibility and impossibility gives the myth its staying power. Meanwhile, historians who have tried to trace the story to its roots have found a much more mundane picture. What actually existed in 1944 and 45 were a few speculative papers, conversations at Hillersleben, and perhaps a handful of sketches. No production orders, no funding streams, no prototypes. But as often happens with history's most vivid legends, the absence of evidence became part of the allure. People asked, if nothing was real, why were the Allies so interested? And why did Operation Paperclip bring over so many scientists if the weapons were all myths? These questions became fertile ground for those who preferred mystery over fact. Pop culture amplified it further. Films, video games, and novels frequently borrow the Sun Gun idea, repackaging it in new forms. Orbital death rays, space-based solar weapons, massive mirrors melting polar ice caps. In these retellings, the Nazi connection is often exaggerated. Secret moon bases, hidden space stations, and occult rituals combined with high technology. While entertaining, these depictions distort the historical reality even more. Yet they also ensure that the Sun Gun remains lodged in the collective imagination, long after most other wartime projects have been forgotten. During the early 2000s, a new twist emerged. As climate change and geoengineering entered public debate, some conspiracy theorists revived the Sun Gun story as evidence of hidden weather control systems. They argued that governments were using orbital mirrors to manipulate storms or droughts. Again, there was no evidence, but the Nazi precedent lent these claims an aura of historical continuity. The Sun Gun had become a universal metaphor, no longer just a Nazi fantasy, but a shorthand for humanity's potential to meddle with the planet on a massive scale. Despite the hype, serious researchers continued to debunk the myth. Physicists pointed out that even a mirror several kilometers across would produce only a fraction of the energy needed to burn cities. The beam would disperse over thousands of kilometers, losing intensity to the atmosphere. The cost of lifting such a structure into orbit would dwarf even the Apollo program. These sober assessments haven't stopped the story from circulating, but they have kept it anchored, at least partially, in reality. As the 21st century progresses, the Sun Gun's place in the public imagination remains secure. It appears in online discussions of what-if scenarios, in speculative articles about space warfare, and in documentaries about Nazi science. For many people, it serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unfettered technological ambition, how easily scientific ideas can be twisted into weapons, especially under regimes that see no ethical limits. Yet there's also a more subtle lesson hidden in its persistence. The Sun Gun demonstrates how ideas can outlive their creators, morphing into myths that influence future generations. A speculative drawing in 1944 becomes a Time article in 1945, a Cold War rumor in the 1950s, a conspiracy theory in the 1990s, and a meme in the 2020s. Each retelling adds another layer, blurring the line between fact and fiction until the original context is almost impossible to recover. By tracing the sun gun through this post-war mythology, we can see not just a Nazi fantasy, but a mirror of our own anxieties. It reflects our hopes and fears about science, power, and the future. If the Nazis imagined weaponizing the sun in the midst of their defeat, what might we imagine today, and where might our own fantasies lead us? The story of the Nazi sun gun begins as a tale of desperation and ends as a mirror held up to human ambition. For a fleeting moment in history, as the Third Reich was crumbling and its armies were retreating on every front, a small group of scientists dared to imagine controlling the sun itself. Whether born from genuine curiosity or blind fanaticism, their vision captured something timeless, the belief that technology could transcend defeat, that science could make gods out of men. After 1945, the war's survivors scattered across a new world order. The ruins of Germany became laboratories for the victors. In Peenemünde, the birthplace of the V2, Soviet engineers packed what machinery they could find onto freight trains bound for Moscow. In the West, American intelligence gathered everything else: engineers, notebooks, prototypes, anything that might give them a head start in the new age of rockets. In that scramble, the sun gun became another piece of the puzzle, filed away alongside diagrams for jet wings and liquid fuel engines. Most scientists dismissed it immediately. It was too big, too heavy, too fantastical. The materials didn't exist. The launch vehicles didn't exist. The orbital precision required was decades away. Yet among the stacks of captured German reports, one couldn't ignore how advanced some of the thinking had been. The same country that dreamed of a mirror in orbit had already built the world's first ballistic missile, invented pulse-jet aircraft, and mapped the upper atmosphere. If they could achieve all that during war, what might humanity accomplish in peace? That question became the quiet legacy of the sun gun. Its original purpose, to scorch cities, was madness. But the underlying idea, harnessing sunlight from beyond the atmosphere, evolved into something visionary. In the 1960s, NASA scientists proposed orbiting solar collectors to beam power to Earth by microwaves. Decades later, Japan and the European Space Agency revisited the concept as a potential solution to the energy crisis. In an ironic twist, the technology once imagined for destruction became a blueprint for sustainability. The weapon turned into a promise. Still, there's an unease that lingers. Every leap forward in science carries within it the same duality, the capacity to heal or to harm. The sun gun reminds us how easily that balance can tilt. The Nazi scientists who proposed it weren't cartoon villains. They were engineers, mathematicians, dreamers working under a regime that rewarded results at any cost. Their calculations may have been sound, but their morality was not. They show us how knowledge, when stripped of ethics, can spiral into something monstrous. Over time, the myth of the sun gun became less about what the Nazis could have built, and more about what people were willing to believe. It revealed a truth about the modern world, that fear and fascination often travel together. The notion that human beings could manipulate sunlight, command the heavens, or melt cities with a beam from orbit is terrifying, but also strangely seductive. It feeds both paranoia and wonder. Every generation rediscovers it, reinterprets it, and projects its own anxieties onto it. In modern culture, the sun gun lives on as a symbol. It appears in documentaries, in conspiracy videos, in video games, even in political rhetoric about space weapons and energy control. Its scientific impossibility doesn't matter. What matters is what it represents, the blurred boundary between innovation and insanity, between progress and delusion. We want to believe that there's always someone, somewhere, building something too powerful for the rest of us to comprehend. Yet behind that myth lies a sobering reality. The real danger has never been a mirror in space. It's the mindset that conceived it. A system that equates power with survival, that treats science as a tool of domination rather than discovery, inevitably breeds fantasies like the sun gun. The Nazi regime, in its final hours, was collapsing under its own contradictions. Its faith in Wunderwaffen, its obsession with spectacle, its disregard for human cost. The sun gun was its last hallucination, a monument to hubris written in sunlight. But in a strange way, the story also illuminates the resilience of human imagination. Even in ruin, people were looking upward, dreaming of what might come next. The same scientific spirit that produced weapons also produced the rockets that would one day carry astronauts to the moon. Many of the men once branded as Hitler's engineers would go on to work for NASA, contributing to peaceful exploration rather than war. Here's a moral paradox that history still wrestles with: how genius and guilt can coexist in the same hands. Today, nearly 80 years after those final days of the war, the sun gun has faded into legend, but its reflection still lingers in the way we talk about technology. When headlines warn of space lasers or climate engineering mirrors, they echo the same anxieties born in 1945, the fear that we may invent something we cannot control. And perhaps that's the real value of the story, not as proof of Nazi advancement, but as a cautionary parable about ourselves. Humanity's reach has always exceeded its grasp. We build machines that touch the stars, yet we struggle to manage the shadows they cast. The sun gun stands as a reminder that every civilization, no matter how powerful, faces a moment when ambition outpaces reason. For Nazi Germany, that moment came at the height of its delusion, when its scientists looked skyward and believed they could bend the sun to their will. What they created instead was a warning, a myth forged from light, a symbol of the peril that awaits when technology serves madness instead of meaning. The sun gun never existed as a weapon, but as an idea it has never truly died. It flickers every time humanity looks to space and imagines using the heavens for dominance instead of discovery. It glows faintly in every conversation about militarizing orbit, every headline about laser satellites, every speculative design that promises control over nature itself. And maybe that is why this story continues to fascinate, because it reminds us that even the most impossible dreams can reveal something deeply real about who we are. In the end, the sun gun was not a beam of fire, but a reflection of fear, arrogance, and longing for control. The Nazis may have conceived it, but the question it raises belongs to all of us. If one day humanity truly possesses the power to focus the sun, will we use it to light the world or to burn it?